All right, so welcome back. So grade recorder done, behind us, understand it, great. Hopefully you know a lot more about designing data store models. What we're going to move into next is a different project. Officially this one's a lab, but I am going to talk about parts of it with you just because I think you'll get more out of it if I kind of talk about it a little bit more detail. The lab is called Dice with Friends. There's a link to the lab right here, but before we get into that, I want to give you some background knowledge. And then we're also going to look at the solution together so that we can kind of design that data store model. So first, some background knowledge. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted you to talk about property options. We've actually seen a couple property options already. And what a property option is it's just the information that you put into like the constructor when you create this property for something. So some property options you've seen before. You've seen the default property option. So we used it in grade recorder mainly just for fun, in that if this value wasn't given, this would be the string that got used by default. So if there was no team name, for example, we put in a default of none. There was really no great advantage in doing that, except for it showed you one property option that you could use. We've also seen another, this one was specific to dates, but whenever we had dates, we could put in options for date times. We could either say auto now add, which what that would do is it would only be when it was created. We also had the option for auto now, which was when it's created or just anytime it's edited, right? And so that was, to be honest, a pretty easy property option, which did some useful things for you. Note, you don't have to use any options with a date time property. If you left it blank, it would just be up to you to write to it, right? Just like a normal property. But that was a good time when a property option made a lot of sense. There's another property option that you really should know about, which is just tremendously useful, and that is repeated. So if you want something to be a list, so instead of making it just a single option, all you have to do is, it's really simple. You just say that it's repeated, and then all of a sudden, instead of being a single object like a single string, it's a Python list of strings. So this property option repeated is really awesome. Let's look at an example of using it. So here's just a simple example. The way this works is here's a string property, and they chose to throw in the option of repeated equals true. Once you throw in repeated equals true, then the way you set it from now on is not just with a single thing, but it's actually with a list. And also, by being a Python list, if you know Python pretty well, there's a lot of cool things you can do with list, right? So the main one we'll use in this app is append, right? So you can easily append something to it, and then when you put it back, that list will just be updated. There's also some cool things you can do with queries. So like if you've got anywhere in your list something that matches this thing, it'll find it. So it works out really well with queries as well. So repeated is something that's hugely important that you don't know about yet, but now you have that added to your bag of tricks. While we're teaching you things, let's also go ahead and tell you about a couple more properties that are out there. For this lab, we're not going to use these, but I wanted to put them in somewhere in the course. And I wanted to tell you about a couple more. So you already know about some of the most important ones. So like string, I would say it's kind of like, it's numero uno. You're going to use string a lot. Number two, if I was saying the next like most important property, I think the key property is hugely important, right? So you want to point to other entities. That's how you make relationships in like your data store models. If I was saying like who's next important, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. I kind of consider things that are numeric values to sometimes be important. So if you wanted an int or a float or a bool, I'll just kind of lump those together and say those are kind of the third most important. And then after that, it just depends on what you're doing, right? So for me, I do a lot with date time properties. Personally, I don't use the user property at all. I just save somebody's lowercase email. There's also a way you could just save their user ID. But to be honest, I save user properties almost never. There are a couple more that it just kind of depends on what you're wanting to do. So there's text property, blob property, and then these structured properties. I think if I was going to rank them, I would say that the structured properties are probably the next most important. What is a structured property? A structured property is an organizational tool, right? So let's say you've got, their example is going to be, let's say you've got a person and they have addresses, right? So addresses might be repeated, but it's not just like a repeated string, it's like a repeated property that has a bunch of things. So we'll see an example for that. There are two variants of structured property. There's structured property and local structured property. The only difference, you can read it in here, is structured property is indexed, local structured property is not indexed. So that means if you're going to need to find it using a query, you want it to be a structured property. If it's just something you're keeping that you don't need to use in queries, it should always be a local structured property. That way it's more efficient. These other two, just to mention over here, text property, that one's really simple. That's just for grabbing long strings. So strings are limited to about 500 characters, but text property is just for long strings. So that one's easy. Blob property, some people use this one a lot. I don't use it as much. This is if you just want to keep some kind of data around that you don't need to index it at all. It's just you just want to keep it around. Some people look at this and they say, that's a great way to store images. Well, not really. If you've got a file like an image, you should use the cloud storage, and we'll talk about that some other day, hopefully. This is more for like let's say you've got a response from some server and it's big and long, like it's the result of something, and you want to keep it around, but you don't necessarily want to reference it a lot. You just stick it in a blob property that just keeps it as binary data. And then whenever you get your entity out, you've kind of got access to that thing. To be honest, I haven't used it much, but some people I know use that one all the time. So I thought I better mention it to you. All right, my next slides are going to talk a little bit more about structured properties and kind of how they work. So a structured property, here's an example right here. So here's the structured property. They did want this one to be indexed, so they use structured property. And in this example, you've got an address, and then you've got a contact, and you'll notice that a contact has a property that is some other property. So you list as the first thing, like what is this other entity, right? In this case, it happens to be repeated, so you've kind of made use of that repeated thing and a structured property together. And so you can see that in this example, that this contact, they made him Guido Van Rossum, I assume, the inventor of Python. So they say that he's got a name, which is just a normal old string, right? Nothing special about that. And then he's got addresses, so it's plural because it's repeated. And then each address is actually its own entity of type address, where it has a type. So apparently his home is in Amsterdam, and then he works in the San Francisco Google office, which apparently is on Spear Street. We're not going to use those in this example, but I wanted to tell you about them because they might be useful for your projects, and this seemed like the best place to fit them in. All right, so that's kind of it on the background. One more thing. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about on kind of the background and preparing for this lab is queries that use and or. Thus far, most of our queries have just been like query and we set an ancestor, or maybe we set one filter, like at most one filter. But you can actually do a lot with filters. One thing that you might want to do is and. And is actually easy. You get and by default. If you just add a filter and then you add another filter, you get an and for free. So really the thing that's new is if you wanted to or something. And the way the syntax for it is a little odd. You say ndb.or, and then you put in brackets, whatever you want to or. Of course, Google's example where it teaches you about or and is like the most complex example I've ever seen, right? So it's an and of two things. So it's an and of this and this whole thing, and then this whole thing consists of an or, where it's an or of this top thing or this giant bottom thing, and then there's an and that's in the bottom there. So if you wanted to read this, it's like if this and this are true, then evaluate that in the next level, and then this has an or between these two. So if either of them are true, so if something was Ruby, it would definitely pass through. And then the top level is an and. So it has to have the tag Python, and then if it also has the tag Ruby, that would work. And there's all kinds of ways through this thing. But and or, they're pretty easy concepts to use, but the syntax is going to be something new to you. Now I'm done with the background information. See you next time when we talk specifics on this Dice with Friends Lab. See you then. Bye.